Together and give a warm welcome to your host, Thomas Owen.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Thomas Owen. I am the Associate Course Director for Sound Design for Games here in the Recording Arts program at Full Sail. And I'm happy to be presenting to you the game audio and music production talk this afternoon. I'd like you guys to give a warm welcome to Jonathan Dodge Mayer, Senior Music Manager of Sony Interactive Entertainment. Welcome. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
It's been a busy week, huh?
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, great stuff going on. You've already had some great talks here this week, and I thought we'd start off today by talking about not just one game, but about sort of life working for a ton of different studios.
Sure.
You've run the gamut of studios that you've worked for huge franchises, and I thought, what do you see across all these different franchises as similarities that make them all successful?
Well, that's a great question. Every studio that I've worked with has its own identity and its own culture, and I think it's really important for us to understand that, and you can't understand it quickly, right? So it's, as with anything, it's about building a relationship. So we try to, when we work with a new studio, we try to sort of take our time and get to know the principals there and sort of understand everything about them, their workflow, what deadlines mean different things to different studios, and just, the whole panoply of, some studios are much more producer driven, and some are kind of have like more of a flat hierarchy where everybody kind of is just collaborating all the time. And for our team, because we move around, it's really important for us to be flexible. And I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned over the years is to not let the experience that I'm piling up as I go hinder me in any way from exploring new ways of doing things. And to the point about what makes them successful, I think that the thing that all the great studios I've gotten to work with have in common is it's pretty simple, and it sounds a little trite, but it's true. It's just a shared sort of interest in excellence, and the studios that understand their own culture are the ones that really get it. And regardless of what end of the spectrum they're on, in terms of their work style or how they talk to each other, how they collaborate, that they all kind of get it, and they're all pushing in the same direction.
So that first meeting when you take on a new client, when you get a studio that comes to you and says, I'd really like you to help us with music on a game, what's that first meeting like with the design team, the whole development team, when you meet with them, when you come over to their studio?
Those vary pretty widely too, but I think we have I try to approach it as a relationship building opportunity, and it's really important. Now I'm coming at this from a music specific background, but this applies to really any discipline, I think, especially if you're servicing a development team. But I think even if you're on a development team, this answer is the same, which is understanding the core of the product you're making. And I think this might even go beyond games, is that it's really important to understand. I use the term tone a lot. Like yesterday when we talked about Uncharted 4, I talked a lot about getting the tone right. And sometimes you can ask, like I can meet with a creative director and ask them questions about the game that maybe they haven't even really, that early in a project. We might start 2 years out, say. And so when we sit down with them, I want to say, what are our goals? Like if it's a story-driven game, if it's a narrative experience, what are we trying to impart to our player? And I don't mean what happens first, second, and third, but I mean like what do I want them to feel, and just really try to keep the conversation at a very high level. And what that does too is it demonstrates that I and my teammates are trying to become part of their team, because that's really where that meeting begins, that process. And that again, it's all about trust, right? So there's a lot of these franchises
Absolutely.
are spending a lot of money,
A lot of money.
and they want us to we want them to have the faith that we can just kind of take the ball and run with it, and that requires a lot of trust.
So if you had any advice for the game designers in the room that are sitting here and they're meeting with an audio team for the first time, what could they bring to the table to help that connect together in a better way early on in the project?
That's an awesome question. I love talking to designers. I've done a few GDC talks that were geared towards design, about music design, and not so much about implementation and stuff. And I think that one area where I want to see our industry improve as much as possible is to bring people together from different disciplines to talk about these things. And I think great things to do. And I think, I don't think games in any way are striving to be movies, but I like looking at film a lot because they've had such a long history of doing what we're trying to do in the narrative space. And I think games ultimately can do more than a movie ever could, especially if the narrative's geared properly towards the medium. But I think looking at examples from either other games or film or television with your design team, or vice versa, having the designers show you things on the audio side, like here's a scene from a TV show that really had that same kind of impact I want to have, and really talking about the connectedness between audio and the narrative. And whenever anyone asks us to put any music anywhere, I like to ask the question, why? And to me, that's super important. And so for designers, like what happens a lot with us when we work with game designers, like level designers and stuff, is they'll say, oh, we don't have music in this fight. But what happens on a really big game is you've got, say an 18 or 20 hour experience, and a particular designer might be responsible for a couple different disparate chunks of that. They might have this mission at the beginning of the game and this level near the end. And my job is to make sure the big picture stays intact. So maybe the first big battle in their level doesn't have any music because we just came out of some total crazy storm of music and sound effects and stuff, and we're trying to give the player a break. Or maybe there's a moment coming up later where it's going to be really important to play music, and I don't want to wear somebody out for 30 minutes before they get to that moment. So if designers and audio people are asking each other why they're doing the things they're doing, really interesting conversations start to happen. And I would say to designers, looking to your audio team for sort of feedback too, because there's there are missed opportunities so much in games where like a level designer, I had a great experience on infamous Second Son right near the end of the project, where I don't know if anybody's played that game, but as you walk at the very beginning of the game, you walk out onto this bridge to get to Seattle, and it's been destroyed. And the director said, you come out of a tunnel, you see this destroyed bridge, and then it's a traversal trainer, so you have to cross the bridge and do all these cool moves. And the director said, man, we don't have the impact when you walk out of the tunnel of seeing the devastated bridge. But when you play the game at that point, you walked out of the tunnel, and you came around the corner, and there's a devastated bridge, and text came up on the screen and told you to, press X to jump. And so I'm like, well, show me the bridge. Like, stop, take the camera, take control away from the player. And I thought I was just, this was like right at the end of the project, so I thought I was just saying something that nobody was going to do anything about it. And he was like, I'll be right back. And he came back with a level designer and an animator, and they put in a camera move, and because the assets are built, right? The bridge, all the rubble's there, the lighting's done. So it's almost free. It took like 4 hours to take the camera away from the player, fly along the side of the bridge. They had some helicopters fly over, and then we scored that, and now that's a moment. So that's a long answer to your question, but
wow.
it's that's the kind of stuff that really I think needs to happen, and it can happen on a small game. You don't need a huge team to add that kind of value to a product. I mean, one designer and one composer or audio guy can do that together. It's just finding the moments and the opportunities.
So let's talk about the point where you actually record the score for the game. So after these meetings and after you decide on figure out who's going to be the lead composer on the game, what's then the process of going from finding a composer to actually making this interactive music system work in an environment? I mean, that's a long process that happens. So how does it go through? How do we go through that?
So our roles, I see my role as serving a couple different masters all at the same time, where my team's responsible for hiring composers, right, on behalf of a developer who is our client. But as soon as that relationship with the composer is intact, I try to treat that composer as much as possible. They might tell you otherwise, but my goal is to treat them like I work for them too. And I want, as a producer, I want to get them what they need to do a good job. And that starts with giving them some runway to figure out what the thing's going to sound like. One of the things in our industry that I hate more than anything is a pre-baked cue list, where somebody says, okay, we've got 18 levels in our game. We need exploring music and fighting music for each level. So that's 36 tracks, and they each need to be this long. And I'm like, well, I haven't even played the game yet. But if I've asked the right questions about tone and the spirit of the game and what are we trying to accomplish, then I can go to a composer and say, you know what, we need some musical suites that speak to love and trust issues, or we need something that feels like I'm going on an adventure or whatever, and start with concepts. And the best composers they're not going to count minutes. They might have a contract that's paying them per minute, but that doesn't start right away. What they start with are ideas. And I think if we do our job right, the composer and me and everybody, I think of it as like a big rain cloud that we build that like swells and swells and swells. And then when the time is right and there is gameplay to be had, we have this money in the bank that we can just start raining down on the game. And then later in the process, it becomes a lot easier. But there's a whole host of questions that come up early on about, where it's important to give the composer the proper inspiration and freedom to just explore. And I think that's the first step.
Are you even worried about the tech at that point when you're getting suites? I mean, how much of that do you have to relay to a composer that may be from a film background, that may not be from a game background? Like, how much do you have to explain to them about game architecture versus how much do you just let them be creative and compose?
My goal is to let them know and experience as much of that as they want to. And I'm in a really unique position because we have a robust team. I know there are some development studios that don't have the resources we do to do this, but our approach is to, and I think this should be everybody's mindset if they're really just trying to get the best music, is to find the composer that creates the thing you want the best. Listen to their reel, study their music, talk to them. It's like a job interview, right? It's a relationship. You're going to be stuck working with this person for a year or two, maybe 3. And then to answer the question more directly, I want to explain to them as much as they need to know. Now, I'm going to be concerned about that tech right up front, but I also, and this is a tough one, working with the developers, we try to prolong committing to what our technical requests are as long as possible because we want to understand the game. One of the worst things in the world you can do is look at like a on-paper macro of a game design and then say, we're going to have a music system that does this, this, and this, and then you finally get your hands on the controls 6 months later, and you're like, this doesn't feel like that at all. Right. So, what we try to do is have the creative development happening in parallel with this technical development, and then we're saving enough of the composer's work so that when we get to the point where we understand the tech, we can direct the composer in whatever way works best for the composer to get us the assets we need. And a lot of it just happens, if it's an orchestral score, a lot of it just happens on the stage. So we're like, just write the music that fits the brief. And then when we're recording, I'll kind of freak the composer out and start going, we'll hear the orchestra play a pass at the cue, and then I'll go, okay, so I need this high string part on its own, I need this brass melody all by itself, and they're like, what are we doing? And it's because that we know that we're going to pull the cue apart and play it back that way in the game. But if we've done our job right, by the time that happens, the trust is there, and they're like, yeah, man, do your thing. But on the other side, there are composers like we just finished we're right now, this week, finishing up the score for Mass Effect Andromeda. And John Paisano, who's written music for the TV show Daredevil and the Maze Runner movies, has done a phenomenal job scoring that game. And he's like way into games. Every time I go to his studio, there's a game on. He's like on pause on some cool game. And he wants to know all this stuff. And he's actually written to the system and iterated with us.
Wow.
And that just makes things even better. He delivers Pro Tools sessions with tracks color-coded by which interactive layer they belong in. And, so they run the gamut.
Wow, so you talked about live orchestras, live musicians, and you're really the champion right now, your team, for having live musicians, live orchestrated scores on a game. How difficult is that? How difficult is it to convince the studio to have that kind of budget for a game? And why isn't everybody doing it?
So it's easier now than it's ever been, and the main reason is because game developers are all super competitive. So, at some point somebody started doing it really regularly, and then we could go to a meeting with another developer and go, well, all the Uncharted music's live, and they, we want to have that too. So that helps, right? And it helps that we're the people that are working with all these different studios because we can kind of encourage them to raise the bar collectively, and they like doing that. They like, and they collaborate with each other a lot too. So today it's not as hard as it was starting out. However, budget's always an issue. And so my goal is to have the elements of a score that should be live. Because we do a lot of hybrid stuff, and synths should sound like awesome synths, and that's it. So that's a whole separate conversation. But if it's, live strings that they're writing with synths or something, my goal is like those strings need to be live. And if we can only afford 12 string players, then it's a conversation about sweetening and keeping the samples in there and stuff. Typically, game developers at this point understand, I think most of them understand the value of live musicians. I can take the best mocked up, with the best sample libraries, orchestral piece that can be made, and there's some composers that can do some really solid mock-ups, and play them a recorded version of that, and you can still, like, anybody can hear the difference. And then on top of that, because we're presenting all our music in quad and surround, we don't use the center channel for mixing, but for music, we use the other 4 speakers, and we stay out of the LFE for a variety of reasons. But because we're presenting everything in quad, there's just a lot we can do in the live production process that we can't get from samples too, in terms of mic placement and stuff. So a more concise answer is that sort of by hook or by crook, we will get as much of a score live as possible. And to do that, we have to be really good at managing budgets. And so our whole team is really creative at convincing you that this music is live, regardless of how much money we have to spend. So it might be a bunch of soloists that we just bring in throughout the process, and it might be 100 and some players at Abbey Road in London. It just doesn't matter. And some of the really small scores we've done with small budgets have been the best. I mean, the score to Journey, which I'm sure most of you have heard, is amazing, and that was not a big budget project, and we did string sweetening and some soloist stuff, but the interesting key to that, though, is that those conversations happen early, and the composer's part of that process, so they know what they're writing for. And I think that's really important. So if you're an aspiring composer, or you're producing a composer, to make sure that you're building your template, so to speak, your paradigm is based on what you're going to have the resources for. And if you're told early on that, hey, we only have $10,000 for all our recording, you don't, with kind of okay samples right for a symphony orchestra.
Right. So for the music composer in the room, that's primarily a laptop composer that primarily writes music all in the blocks, what advice would you give to them to how to break out of that and to start incorporating live musicians into the work that they're producing?
I believe, I for fun on the side, I write and produce a lot of, what people call electronic music. It's not. It's electroacoustic music, because I believe that that distinction, to me, is just a dead issue, and that you can do a lot with very little live recording. So if you have a microphone and a preamp, there's no excuse for you not to have live elements in a track. And even if you're doing 100% electronic score, if you're doing something like Mac Quayle's score to Mr. Robot or something like that, where it's supposed to sound electronic, you can still work in live elements and have them, process them to sound electronic, and that changes, that makes you unique. But on the flip side, if you're doing, if you're writing, something that's highly emotional and you want a solo cello, man, pick up the phone, find a cellist. There's got to be someone in your network of friends that can, play a passable cello part, and get your one mic and your preamp and record that thing. And record it well in a quiet room, with the mic somewhere near the cello, and you're doing better than using a sample, right? Or if you play an instrument, incorporate that into your writing. If you're a guitar player, and you have, a nice nylon string guitar and you're writing an emotional cue, start with that and build your sound around that. And maybe you only need that, so play to your strengths. And, any little live thing, and as a drummer, I preach this a lot, when it comes to percussion especially, don't just live in your sample libraries, because they all sound the same, and you can go a lot further with, say, like puffy mallets on a floor tom than a bunch of taiko samples that everybody uses. And so if you experiment with close micing that floor tom, detuning it, and then just turning it up and putting a lot of reverb on it in your mix, that's like a way more impressive, say, like war drum or something, than one of these sample libraries that we all have.
That's great. If you think about it, once you have this recorded, we're not even close to done with the project.
No.
Right? Once all this is recorded, we then have a long way to go before the project is done. How much work is there to be done after you have all of these suites recorded? What's the next step that your team goes through?
So people ask me a lot, what's the difference between, producing music for a game and producing music for a film? And I say, it's exactly the same. We produce the music just like a film score, and then we make a game. So it's about it. Chronologically, it's not exactly halfway in the project. We might record a little later in the project, but half or less of the work is done by the time I'm sitting with a finished mix that's stemmed out and ready to edit and implement. I'm not halfway done with a big game. And that if we commission, so on a decent sized game, we might commission 120 minutes of original music. That's a good number, 2 hours. And we'll probably make 5 to 7 hours of content out of that 2 hours of material. It's generally more than 3,000 assets that have to go into the game. And that editing and then the implementation work is all done by our team, and it's all part of this process. We see it as one contiguous process. It's why we mix so many of our own scores, and even if a composer has a mixer they like to work with, we generally bring them in to our process, because we need to be able to go back to the mix and iterate. Somebody might, an implementer might be backed up against the wall at the end of the project and say, you married this shaker and this tambourine into one stem, and I need them separate. So we have to go back to the mix. We have to reopen that mix. We have to reprint the stems. We have to re-edit the cue and put it back in the game. And so I think the bulk of the man hours on some of our biggest projects we log 6,000, 7,000 hours on. And I think 60 to 70% of that is from that point on.
So you're in a position where you have kind of the luxury of having a specialist for implementing and a specialist for being a composer and a specialist for being an orchestrator. But on a lot of the projects, the sizes that you'd start out on, there's just one person.
Yeah.
There's not a whole team. There's not 20 people. You just have one guy. You're the audio guy for the game. That's it. You're the sound designer. Maybe you're the composer as well. You also have to do some scripting. How do you learn it all?
You can't, but you can. I mean, it's a value proposition, I think, at the end of the day. And what I mean by that is that if you're in a position to do that, especially early on, if you're making a small game with friends you met here, or it's your first gig out of school, you have to recognize that you're in a really good position and try not to do everything. And if you look at a lot of games, indie games that have been really successful, I don't know, did anybody play Inside last year?
My favorite game last year.
Okay, if you didn't and you're studying games, you better, because it's amazing, and especially the audio. But one guy with a little help from a couple other people did the entire soundscape of that game, and he's brilliant because he focuses on the things that'll matter, right? So I'm not sure about sort of learning it all, but what I think the answer is play to your strengths, right? So if you're a brilliant composer, then use your music chops to sound design the game. And don't try to do too much. Like, figure out, and this is what I mean by the value proposition, is like, figure out what matters. Maybe the game doesn't need dialogue. Maybe they've planned all this dialogue and you're like, hey, game designer guy, partner on this game, you're a really good animator. Why don't we use gestures and physical movement and ditch the dialogue, and I'll just focus on some musical sound design and we'll call it a day, right? And it's so put your eggs in the basket that you know is going to be best for you. And I think through that, because the first project I did at Sony was just me and an intern, and it was a AAA size game. It was a game called Siphon Filter Dark Mirror, and the things I'd do differently if we went back to do it is kind of incorporate this advice I'm giving now into focusing more on things that will sound polished to the player. Like, if you can be objective and look at the game and say, what equals polish on this, and not doing what we did, which was stay up till 5 a.m. every night, sleep for like a couple hours, and then get back to work and do everything, right? And we were trying to, and we weren't even doing the sound design. This was just music, but the implementation and all the there was a lot of tech stuff that we had to deal with, and I was sitting there like composing at a desk, and my partner Ernest, who was our intern at the time and still works with us, is genius implementer, was implementing the last cue I had printed, like at a terminal next to me, and and then saying, oh, I need this, so I'd have to go back and reopen the queue and print something differently, and we tried to do too much, and the game came out fine, but we practically killed ourselves. And I think if we had zoomed out a little bit and just spent a little more time on the things that really mattered to the player, that we would probably saved ourselves some heartburn.
The next thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is prototyping these systems. And once we have a suite of music set up, and if that's your strength, what tools do you use to prototype? Everything's free now. All of the game engines are all free to download. All the middleware tool is free to download. So where do you go to actually test out? How do you test out how it's going to work in the game before the game's done?
So if we don't have access to whatever the audio engine is, I tend to throw stuff. We either throw it in Pro Tools. Like if we're demoing it, say for the design team or a programmer who's going to help us build the tech, we'll basically do an elaborate scoring to picture job with, and we might even pop text on the screen and say, this is where the switching happens for this behavior or whatever. So it could be as dumbed down as that. It could be, I just edited this in Pro Tools. I keep a copy of Ableton Live handy all the time because it's my favorite way to prototype stuff. I can't believe that there's not a game music tool built just like that, because that's essentially what it is an interactive audio player. It even has a crossfader for testing fade transitions and stuff, but ideally we'll have access to the tool set early on, and we work with every tool set on the planet and a gazillion proprietary ones too. And so we don't have any say. We might be part of the conversation, but we can't dictate what tool set a team uses. So we have to be flexible. And the important thing, and this is where prototyping is super important, is that the concepts are what matter. So, it doesn't matter what brand of hammer I use to drive a nail into a board. And so we tend to try to stay tool agnostic in our concepts, and then sell the concepts, and then get the tool to do what we want. So it's a little bit of a circle. It's like we start off prototyping in weird ways, and then eventually, hopefully not too late in the process, we get the music working in the right tool, and then can kind of tweak and fine-tune stuff. And we tend to ask for a lot of tweakability up front, and that's a product of experience. So if you are working with a team that has some engineering resources to put towards your music tool, because none of these off-the-shelf things do everything. Right. Identify what is going to matter in your game, and start leaning that way. So that if there is some thing about the game that a programmer can expose to you early on to your audio engine, that you just ask for it, even if maybe you don't use it that much. That you just have those hooks hanging there, and then because at the end of the project, when you ask for those things, everybody just says no.
From a composer, once the music is done, or close to done, or recorded, what's the integration that you have with the sound design team that's at the studio? What's the relationship between the two? Sort of, it's not all the same team, right? Your team is music.
Yeah.
And the sound design team, you're working with a different team almost every game, right? So what's the relationship there between sound design and music?
Well, luckily, pretty much all the developers we work with have really strong, seasoned audio directors. So the goal is to make sure that the communication among those disciplines, dialogue, sound effects, and music are. And sometimes there's a separate post team, like on a game the scope of the Uncharted series, the cinematics are actually posted by a post facility and brought back into the game. So there's a bunch of sharing that goes on there, right? Like the post facility waits on in-game sound effects from the team to post the movie, so that if there's gunfire in the movie, it's the same gunfire you hear in the game, and all that kind of stuff. The Foley is all shared, everything. So as far as collaborating goes, we try to, if there's temp music in a game when we start, we try to eradicate that as quickly as possible with the composer's compositions. Even if there's synth mock-ups, even if we don't have stems yet, we'll do stereo edits and just throw stuff in the game, because we want not just the rest of the audio team, but the entire team to understand our intentions, and we want the feedback. This is a team sport, whether there are two of you making a game or 200. You're part of a collaborative entity, and you have to be looking for feedback all the time, because everybody that has something to say, that understands the game and has something to say about it, is probably saying something you should hear. That doesn't mean they're always right, but you have to be listening. And so having your work available to the people you're working with as soon as possible is super important. And then those conversations can happen. And really, because there are a lot of ways you can screw up, right? Like if you're making a Call of Duty game and it's gunfire constantly, and your composer uses, drums in that frequency range, snare drum type sounds a lot in their music, you've just caused a huge problem for the game mix. So these are conversations that need to happen early on. How much music do we want in combat? What's the combat going to sound like? Are you going to, how are you going to mix the player experience. The player's weapon's going to be super loud, and then the other weapon's going to be quieter. Where are our opportunities to blend these things? Where do we stay out of each other's way? And that conversation should start right away and continue throughout the entire process if you're doing it right.
How does that conversation change when you're working with a narrative game versus when you're working with an open world game? There's a lot of different challenges from one to the other.
So systems are really important, right? So early on in a project, even if it's a linear experience, but especially if it's more open, you have to come up with systems that make sense, that you can depend on, because you can't mix. I mean, we just, like I said earlier, finishing Mass Effect, we were told at the beginning of that project, we'd never worked with BioWare before, and we were told, no one person on this team is going to play this entire game. It's too big. So it was all about system design and coming up with ways to subvert the need to moment by moment mix everything we do. In a very linear game like Uncharted 4, we have to make time for a really concerted film style mix playthrough. And it's tough because the team doesn't give you that time. Every team says they will. At the beginning of every project, they're like, okay, and then everybody will be locked out 2 weeks before the game ships, and audio will get to clean up the mix. And that 2 weeks comes and goes, and everybody's just checking in everything all the time, and all the animations changing. And so you have to be, I think the most important thing is you have to be mixing the game all the time, everybody. So you're making a huge mistake, and you're doing yourself a huge disservice if in a hurry to get work done, you're just checking things in, putting things in the game to basically hold their place, and you're saying, I'll mix this later. Every day that there's audio in that game, it should have a mix that you're okay with people hearing. That's the most important thing, because you're never going to have time to do it right, ever.
So I think one of the games everyone's looking forward to is Last of Us 2. I think a lot of people in the room have seen the trailer for it and are really excited about it. There are a lot of sequels that have come out. We did a whole talk yesterday on Uncharted 4. Mm-hmm. Got the God of War series. You're doing a Mass Effect on top of someone else's work.
Yeah.
How do you keep raising the bar each time? What's for these franchises that are the biggest franchises in the industry? What do you do at the beginning, at the middle, at the end to make sure that the next one exceeds everyone's expectations?
It's hard because there's if you read YouTube comments and stuff like that, which someone in my position should never do, but I do anyway. You can't win in this situation, right? So if you try to change an existing franchise at all, one of the big ones is that I don't know if anyone saw my talk yesterday, but if you've played Uncharted 4. One of the big things we did was a redesign on the tone of the main menu. So when you load the game, it's the first Uncharted game that doesn't play the traditional version of Nate's theme, which on Uncharted 1, 2, and 3 is the identical sheet music on every one of those games, but re-recorded each time for some reason. I don't know why we didn't have to do that, but we did. And it was cool because the production values went up, so we had bigger orchestras each time. And then because of the tone shift and stuff in Uncharted 4, we knew that vibe wasn't going to work, but we tried a lot of different things. We had other cues from Henry that were a little darker. And immediately when the game came out, it was like Reddit was like, just furious. Reddit was mad at us. We changed something. But I think it was the right decision. I mean, for that. So the answer is you kind of have to operate in a vacuum and just step back at some point and say, okay, we're starting over. All that stuff we did before and all the stuff we know about what we did before, it's in there. So I can trust that I have that and that I'm going to honor this franchise. But what can we do next to elevate this thing? And it requires a certain amount of, and I'm really lucky because, and this is a horrible problem to have on some level, but it's really good for things like this, and that I'm just never happy with anything I do. And so I've learned to just finish things and be cool with it and be like, okay, that's good. Let's move on to the next thing. So it's good for me to start to have another crack at a franchise. But you can drive people crazy in my position, wanting to change everything all the time too. So I have to be careful with that. But if you have it's different. Like if you're like on Mass Effect and on Uncharted 4, we had different composers. And that helps, you get a fresh take on it. You get a little bit of different creative insight from those people. So one answer is leverage your personnel, right? Talk to your composer and say, hey, this sound is really important, but what would you do differently to take it in this direction? And let them tell you, they're the experts. And then on the flip side, if you have the same composer, I see my role as one where I need to really make sure, while keeping them engaged and excited about the project, I'm pushing them and keeping them from settling in to some comfort zone and just throwing ideas at them. Let's change up the sound palette. Let's add an instrument. Let's do, the main theme to The Last of Us plays on the tag of that trailer, and it's the same theme, but it's played with an instrument we never used in The Last of Us. It's a banjo. So that's cool, we heard that and we were like, whoa. And that was all Gustavo. But, just something that simple is just interesting, right? It's like, oh, all of a sudden we're in a different place. It sounds different. He's producing it differently. So any little thing can help. But those conversations are super important to have. And again, you have to be really careful because it's not just fans that get upset about this stuff. We work for a lot of people that are spending money to double down on the success of something you've already made. So when you go, we're going to change this, they're like, oh, wait a second. But we get a lot of support in our organization for that, for being creative.
Maybe we'll hear some conversations with the audience now. Get some Q&A.
I'd love to, yeah.
Anyone have any questions for Jonathan?
Hi, my name is Caleb, and I appreciate you coming out, and I still have nightmares from the first Uncharted game in the bunker.
Cool.
So my question is what tips do you give to music producers who want to get in your industry and work basically nonstop, like what your group, like organization?
Well, I think that finding a place to start is really important, and I think knowing, excuse me, what you want to do is really important. So, we get a lot of we have an internship, and a lot of applicants we get are composers, who apply as a composer and they want to be a composer, and they're looking at our internship as a way to get behind the scenes. And that's not really a good fit for our team because that's not what we do. So if you're interested specifically in production, I think finding opportunities, whether it's with a small developer who may only have a few people like we were talking about earlier, and being the music specialist for them, could be important. I think the most important thing is finding people, whether it's our team or there are other companies or a developer who, and this is going to sound really simplistic, but it's the truth, who are doing the thing you want to do and trying to help them with anything they need. And if that's, one of the things, one of our most successful interns, one of the first things he did in his first month was we have this closet where we keep all the sheet music. I don't even know why we keep it all, it's all digital, but when we come back from a session, we have boxes of all the charts, all the parts. And he organized the crud out of that closet. I mean, it's so I can go in there, and it's actually been practical. We'll have to go reference a score for some reason, and it's actually easier now to go into that closet than to look it up in a digital file. I can find it faster because I don't have to look at a database and naming convention. It's like I open the closet, and there's all these bins, and one says, God of War 3, and I pull that bin out, and they're all organized by number and stuff. So he still works for us, and it's because he made himself invaluable doing all the things that any one of us could have been doing but didn't really have time to do, gave us more time. And the thought of that guy leaving for 15 minutes scared the crap out of us. So we were like, hire that guy, keep him here. And so it's about finding a way to make yourself invaluable and being okay with starting small. But at the same time, if you're producing music, if you want to be a music producer, make sure you're always producing music, because groups like ours aren't gonna let someone fresh out of school come in and run a recording session that's costing the company $300,000 in a week or something. They're gonna want you to run errands or get coffee or something. But it's a craft, right? Producing music is a craft, so find people you can work with and produce music for them. Offer to work with your friends and do some work for free, whether you're just like mixing a track or doing some editing for someone or sitting in on a session and helping them out. Because those two things go hand in hand, and it's hard to get. You can get a lot of observational experience on the job, assisting people that are doing what we do and helping. But you can also get a lot of experience just doing stuff on your own and making mistakes and learning what your tricks are and what do you like and what you don't like. And so I would recommend, basically pursuing all those things at once, which sounds a little tiring, but you're young and you can do it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Hey, how you doing, Jonathan?
Hey.
First of all, Zachary Cook, Recording Arts. Can't wait to have your class in a couple of months. I'm really excited about that. My question is, in the beginning of a project, when you take on a new game, it's a two-part question. One, are you typically working on more than one game at a time? And when you start a new game, if you are working on another one, what's the template? Do you lay out something on a whiteboard or a cork board and okay, we need to do X, Y, Z? Is there a template that you follow traditionally when you go into a new game, and how you follow those stages through all the way to the end?
So to answer your first question, our team is working on about 20 titles right now. It sounds bad when I say it, but we have a lot of help though. And there's myself and a brilliant producer named Keith Leary, who's the other music manager in our San Diego office, and we split those titles. So I have about 10 right now that I'm working on. But again, I have an amazing team, and they really do the lion's share of the work. So the beginning of a project, actually, the number of titles we're working on kind of helps us because it gives us a perspective that the developers on their own don't really have. I mean, we've been seeing into other people's engines, and we've been spotting, problems with certain ways of approaching things that will pay off when it comes to the next project. But building the template for the score anyway really starts with that conversation I was talking about, where you ask the right questions. Listening to existing music is really important. It's really all about connecting the team with the right talent, in this case it would be a composer, and setting that composer up to succeed. And regardless of how much time we have to do that, making sure that everyone's really communicating well and on the same page about that stuff. Because I've worked on projects where that wasn't clear and we got pretty far into it and bad things start to happen, right? Like I've had a director say to me, yeah, I really don't like any of this music. And we're like halfway done, and those are hard problems to solve. So being really clear up front is huge. And the whiteboard kind of stuff comes in handy a lot more with music system design. I mean, I don't know if you saw the pictures I had in the presentation yesterday, but that's for real. That's not a joke. Like there's those conversations are happening all the time, and expressing ourselves in any way possible sort of in that medium is important. But listening to music, I just want to reiterate, is really important, because I think a lot of people like to talk about music, and everybody, whether they're a music professional or not, thinks they know a lot about music. And it's easy to be dismissive of people with no musical knowledge who come into a room, like maybe a director or a game designer. And your job, if you're an audio or music professional, is not to know more than those people. I mean, it is, but that's you don't need to let them know that. Your job is to make them feel comfortable talking to you about music and getting them to play you music. There's an old saying, I don't know who it's credited to, that talking about music is like dancing about architecture. Mm-hmm. And we all describe music differently with words. But if you can get someone to play you some music they like, or you can play them some music and get some feedback from them, you're much further down the road than if you just sit around talking for hours and hours. And both things are practical, but making the people you're working with comfortable, because most people are really insecure about talking to you, a music professional or an audio professional, about music or sound design or whatever. Whether you mean to or not, your knowledge intimidates them. And so you have to really be conscious of your impact on your collaborative team, because you're not going to be successful if they're not communicating effectively with you. And so it's a very two-way process, and you have to be open and receptive to feedback. You can't be defending your work, and that starts right at the beginning. Being defensive about work you've done is a deal breaker right off the bat when it comes to collaboration. You just being open and taking stuff in. So just ask a lot of questions, I think, is the most important.
I think we have a question up front.
Oh. I have a question for the live chat group.
Oh, great.
Josh, who is a recording arts major, would like to know how one goes about finding an internship for sound design and audio implementation after graduation.
So I don't know the specific answer. I mean, I know that career development here is aware of a lot of those, like especially corporations like ours post them online. And it's very clear sort of what the application procedure is and how to get in. But I mean, this was in a different field. When I left school here, I went to work at recording studios, but I think the process is the same, where you need to start researching and listing the companies that you think you might be able to help and that are making things that you want to work on, and just contacting them. You can contact the HR department at any company and ask them that question, and they'll generally get back to you. So I think that's where you start. But researching, aim high and research the companies you want to work for. I mean, we've hired interns at our place that came in the door with a cover letter that said, I want to work for the PlayStation music team.
I think not waiting until you get out of school to look for experience is important too. We have a lot of resources here at Full Sail that will be helpful. Talk to your career development, talk to your course directors. There are internships on campus, as well as possibilities to do external work, but not waiting until you graduate, I think, is super important for that.
I'm Austin from music production. I was wondering, yesterday you were talking about how you used AI manipulation in Uncharted. What other technology and techniques are you using throughout the industry?
Sorry. So on Uncharted, what we were doing was basically receiving a variable from a state from the artificial intelligence in the game. So basically, the enemies had a multitude of states that they could be in, and we receive that information, and then that's a variable in our music system. So that's not really a technological trick so much as it is just asking for the right information to be fed to the music system. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier in understanding the game, right? So you've played the game, and so your job as a music guy is to play the game and ask questions about, how's this supposed to work? And it might be a broken early build of the game with gray boxes and stuff, but conceptualize that experience and say, oh man, it'd be really great if my character's proximity to this object influenced the music mix or something, and ask for that. And so to answer your question about what we've done in that case, it's all over the board, because every game is unique. So, we do things like in the first few Uncharted games, I talked about this yesterday too, we just aggregated variables that basically amounted to a threat level or danger level to us. In the fourth one, we split it into things the player did and things the AI did, and combine those to create the groove and the melodic stuff. It really, the answer is really convoluted because every game's different. So I think it's about understanding the game and then talking to the game designers and getting the information you need. And I tend to, I said this earlier too, but I ask for more than I might need. I ask for things that I don't know if they're going to work, but frequently it's pretty easy I mean, I'm not a programmer, but most programmers have used the word trivial in describing the things I tend to ask for. If I hey, we'd like to see this, we'd like to see that. Oh, that's trivial. So, we just ask for a lot early on and then get it. I hope that's a good enough answer.
For those of us who are game designers and we're not composers, we're not music production, but we're new and we're making games, smaller games, and we might not have, we're limited on software, hardware options, maybe even music experience. What advice can you give us when it comes to us working on smaller games, implementing music and sound ourselves, to keep the spirit of music production still alive and good in our games?
That's an awesome question. I want to work for you someday. That's a fantastic question. The work to your limitations is the answer. So say all you can do is start and stop music. I've worked with music engines where they couldn't stop music before, which is crazy, right? Like, we've had games where we've said, okay, we want to have, in our script, we want to have a start command and a stop command, and we want to be able to loop, and then they'll be like, whoa, wait a second, stop. The music doesn't stop. This is like you turn on the game and the music plays. So figure out, if you're building something in Unity or whatever engine it is, and you only have the capability of that engine, or if you build your own engine or whatever, figure out what you can do, and then base your design around that. The worst thing you can do is sort of have a mismatch between your technological capability and your musical game plan, so to speak, or sound game plan. So just simple things like, in a lot of less evolved engines, maybe when you go between load screens, all your audio cuts off. So that, right? So design your game so that you have a nice tapered fade out of your audio and your music before that load happens. Find a point in your level where you're like, okay, or extend the mission stat screen at the end of the level so you can let the audio finish so your player doesn't get, cut off audio. And that's just one example, but like any limitation you have is just an opportunity for you to design your game a little better, I think.
Hello? Okay. Another question from the live chat. Nicola, music production major, would like to know if you apply a lot of music theory when composing music for video games.
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is yes. I haven't done a lot of composition lately. We're pretty much managing other people do that. But in the past, when I have, it's everybody's different. I'm a pretty well-educated music theory person. I wouldn't consider myself, I'm not like a classical musical theorist. I don't have super deep knowledge, but I have a strong musical theory background, and I think, I don't think you can know too much about it. I also think that you need to know things like harmony theory and counterpoint and stuff like that well enough to know what you're doing and when you're breaking the rules. I think there's a difference between breaking all those rules accidentally and coming up with something cool and knowing what's actually happening. It becomes tough. The further you get in your career, it becomes tough to work. It depends on the kind of music you want to write. If you're writing exclusively synth-based stuff, and it's real like EDM style kind of drone-based music, maybe you can get away with very little knowledge. But if you're writing for an orchestra and you're going to be collaborating with people like me and an orchestrator and a conductor, you have to be able to speak the language. So I think if your goal is to be a composer for media, that you need to expand that knowledge base as much as possible and keep learning. It doesn't stop.
I'm Nick Cassidy in music production degree. For somebody like me or other people that want to compose for video games, what's something you and a company like yours looking for in our demo reels, looking for from us in a first conversation, stuff like that?
So experience, which is something that is tough to hear when you're starting out, right? You need to start, like I was saying earlier, I mean, it was a different question, but honing your craft. So can you deliver 3 to 5 minutes of finished music a day? Can you iterate, fast as lightning, basically? How do you handle feedback? How attached are you to the ideas you put out there? We really like to work with people that are just, wide open and willing to do anything and try different things and don't seem attached to their music, don't, spend a lot of time trying to defend it. And the great thing about being that kind of composer that doesn't sit, if somebody says, this theme's not really working for me, is that if a composer sits there and argues with you at that point, first of all, you're not going to tell somebody that the way they feel is wrong because it's subjective. So that's a bad conversation to get into in the first place. But if you're the guy that's willing to just be like, well, here are 3 other ideas or whatever, let me try something else, and you don't seem to be precious about the one thing you put out there, when you do feel the need to defend something, your relationship with that client will be so strong that they're going to listen to you. If you've written 80 minutes of music and you've just done whatever they asked you to, and all of a sudden one day you're like, no, guys, I feel really strongly about this, they're all going to sit up and listen. But going back to sort of getting in the door, it's lots of experience, and the place you want to start, in my opinion, is working for other composers. I don't think we're working on small, indie games and stuff like that, and I think doing both those things at the same time is really important. There aren't many instances I know of, and I don't want this to discourage anyone because this isn't meant to be discouraging, but it's pretty rare for somebody right out of school or up and coming to just jump onto a AAA game and start, working on a $100 million project. It doesn't happen a whole lot. And that's because there's a whole bunch of stuff you need to know before you do that. And a lot of it's not about the music you write. A lot of it's about the job, which is different than, like a lot of us can sit there and say, like, I write this really cool music. I know it's cool. Everybody likes it and stuff. But again, those questions I asked, like, can you deliver 3 to 5 minutes finished per day under pressure with iterations? Can you stem the music you write quickly? You need a staff to do that stuff, right? I mean, we're typically looking for people with teams, but you become that person. Everybody I've met has been mentored by a composer. So finding composers that are doing that, whose music you think is cool, and offering to work cheap, running errands for them or helping out, and starting to learn. And if you're there every day, and you're enthusiastic, and you got a good vibe, and they're going to want to keep you around. Like I said earlier, if you become indispensable, you're quickly going to get more and more opportunity to do that stuff. And at the same time, on the side, you need to be writing constantly. Right now, while you're in school, you need to try to write and finish a piece of music on a regular basis as quickly as possible. Don't spend a bunch of time making it perfect. Quantity is really important at this stage in your career. But just real quick, just because I don't want to discourage anyone, you guys can all do this. Like, you're not fighting over a little piece of pie. There's lots of pie. There's pie like falling out of the sky everywhere. There's so much work to be done. Everybody needs help with whether it's, whatever sort of aspect of these disciplines you're in. So please don't hear that and tell yourself that it's too difficult to get there. Because if you're persistent and you have a good attitude, this isn't. It's just music. It's not that big a deal. We're not doing brain surgery. People's lives don't depend on this stuff. So you can all do this, and you just have to stick with it and tell yourself, stay out of your own way, because you'll get there.
That's great.
Hi, I'm Michael Parker. I work in music production, and in your Uncharted lecture, one of the most important things you kind of went upon was tone. And when you worked with composers, there are certain kind of themes, like with the love and trust theme, you said that they put it in, they use the same score and theme, but put it in differently and implement it in different ways, but it's the same score. I've noticed in my studies that either more and more people are doing this or they've been doing this. Do you find it important to keep a song, a composition, and layer it through the game or whatever project you're working on consistently to kind of keep the same feel, or like keep the importance of the tone?
Yeah. Short answer, yes. I mean, there are a couple different aspects to what make thematic music successful. The most important being the theme itself, right? Like a recognizable, accessible melody that's simple and that sticks with you is one thing, right? But it's pretty rare that somebody, especially somebody who's not a music person, would hear your theme once and remember it. So repetition, to me, is like the second most important thing. And then the third most important thing is design. And what I mean by design is that the repetition is by design, right? And so those like the montage of the love and trust theme that I showed you is something that's carefully planned out. The Last of Us has a lot of really great examples of this too, where little bits of really simplistic 3 or 4 note melodies are woven throughout the game, played on different instruments, presented in different ways, but they're there for a very specific reason. You know, this is another Joel and Ellie moment. We got to do this, you know? And what's cool about that approach is that if you map that stuff out early and you experiment with it as you go, it makes your job late in the process much easier, because you have your marching orders. You get a new cutscene from the team and you go, oh, this is another one of those times. And you might have to write something new for it, but you know what you're writing and you know what you're trying to say. So, yeah.
I think we have time for a couple more.
Okay. Hi, I'm
Hi.
Dang from game design, and I think you might have answered this, but I'm wondering, what is your work ethic?
Sorry?
Your work ethic on your job?
Like a typical day?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm waiting to find out. For everybody on our team, we all sort of we all carry a lot of responsibility. So we might be, I spend a lot of time on the phone helping people solve problems, basically. One thing I always ask myself when I talk to the people that I'm working for or working with is if I'm doing everything I can to make their day better. And so I try to structure my days in that way. I'm not always successful at it, and I'm sure some of them would say I'm not too. But a typical day could be, to be really specific, I tend to work from about 10 to 7, but when I leave work, there's usually stuff to do, so I'm doing emails later and stuff. But I feel really strongly that it's important to make a lot of time for family and all that stuff, and I think that's a good practice to develop early on, even if you're working your butt off trying to get in the door somewhere. Just mental health's important. But I typically work from about 10 to 7. I spend a lot of time in the mornings talking to my team and finding out what challenges people have that day, if they need anything from me, if I need anything from them, making sure they know about it and I'm not dropping things in their lap to scare them. I spend a lot of time talking to our developers about what they need, getting feedback from people, conveying that feedback to composers. While I'm doing all that, I'm usually typing a couple hundred emails probably throughout the day. And then if we're recording, those days are basically blocked out. I mean, a typical recording session for us for an orchestra runs from is about 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. And those are really intense days where every minute that you spend, you're paying a whole bunch of people a lot of money to get music done, and so those days can be totally different. So I mean, it's like, I'm not really answering your question because I don't really know, but it's a kind of all over the place. And then if we're finishing a game, I might be on site with a developer, walking around, checking in with designers about what's changed in a level, asking them to do something that'll help make the music better in their level, fixing a bug that we have in the music system, that kind of stuff.
I think we have time for one more.
Hello, Jeremy Brown,
Hi.
Recording Arts. My question, I don't know if it's stupid or not, but as a person that doesn't know anything about gaming and the music industry for it, what are companies that a person would want to look into for interning or even to start?
So, I mean, I think I answered that question earlier, talking about researching game companies. But let me say this: if you're planning on approaching a game company as an audio professional, whether it's music or sound design or dialogue or whatever, or frankly design or at any discipline, you better be crazy passionate about games. When we interview folks at any level, whether it's an intern or like a more experienced editor or something like that, the conversation we have with them doesn't involve audio at all. Their experience, I mean, if they're an intern, it doesn't really matter. We just look at if they went to a school like Full Sail, or there are a variety of institutions that we just trust the degree program works and that they'll know enough to learn from us. The conversation's about games. And so if you show up to a game studio and you can't talk about, your favorite latest game and, what you didn't like about this game and what you liked about that game, if you're not super passionate and ready to go way down the rabbit hole with a bunch of game geeks, I would steer clear of the game industry. Because one thing that the game industry gets a lot of is people who go, hey, that's a way to make money. I'm super into music, but these game things are doing well. And I'm not suggesting that's you at all, but I'm just saying, if you're into it, if you think you're into it now, then go deep on the research and understand the medium and play games and have an opinion about the games you play, and go online and watch talks by the people who made those games and know games. That's the most important thing. Because I'm a music guy. I came up through the recording industry. I worked in recording studios. I've been working at PlayStation for 12 years. And I can talk about games with game designers. And if I couldn't, they'd sniff me out right away and it'd be, boop, you're out the door.
Last one.
Hello, my name is Ian from music production. For the game music composers, do they get paid by numbers of songs they write, or do they get paid by a whole entire project?
Contracts are contracts, so they get negotiated differently on every project. But the norm in the gaming industry is that for custom music composition, the contracts tend to be based on a per minute rate. And the rate varies wildly depending on the composer's experience level and the budget of the game. Sometimes really experienced composers will work for less on a lower budget project because they're really excited about it artistically or something. And it's the same in film too. So it's the range could be from a few $100 a minute to thousands of dollars per minute. So it just depends on the composer. And it also depends what they deliver, So if a composer's delivering finished recording material, their per minute rate might be a little higher than if they're just delivering MIDI mock-ups, and then we're still holding a budget to record all that music too, because we have to keep some of that money in reserve.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for attending. Let's give a round of applause to Jonathan Dodge Mayer. Thanks for all your knowledge. It's
my pleasure. I love talking to you guys.